On the seventh day, the mountain man leaves a horse, expecting her to flee, but the skeletal woman stands defiant, her emaciated frame trembling. "The world below," she whispers, "is a death more certain than this mountain." He stares, his solitude challenged by her unyielding will. What brutal secret binds her here? This broken spirit will shatter everything he thought he knew. He dwelled amidst the granite giants, where the wind sang its ancient, lonely song through the gnarled pines, and the snow fell with a silence that swallowed all lesser sounds. Elias had forged his existence from the very essence of this wilderness, a life he had deliberately chosen to escape the pretense and clamor of the world below. His cabin, a fortress of hand-hewn logs and stone, clung precariously to a ridge, its smoke a solitary plume against the vast, indifferent sky. He was a creature of routine and resilience, his days marked by the rhythmic swing of an axe, the keen eye of a hunter, and the quiet satisfaction of self-sufficiency. The mountain was his only confidant, its challenges his only companions. Yet, even in the heart of such fierce independence, a gnawing emptiness had begun to fester, a silent craving for a warmth that fire alone could not provide. It was this craving, a weakness he barely acknowledged, that had driven him to seek a companion through the distant, impersonal channels of a mail-order arrangement. Each time, the outcome was the same: a woman, unprepared and often unwilling, facing the stark reality of a life stripped bare. Her brief stay would serve only to deepen his conviction that his world was meant for one soul alone. And then, the stagecoach lumbered into the small, desolate outpost at the mountain's base, its weary passengers disembarking into the biting wind. His eyes, accustomed to scanning distant horizons for game, narrowed as he watched her descend. She was not the image his fading hopes had conjured. No sturdy frame, no hardy spirit evident in her posture. Instead, she was a wisp, a shadow against the rugged backdrop, as if sculpted from the very air that threatened to carry her away. Her clothes hung loosely upon a frame that seemed to consist of little more than bone, and her face, pale and drawn, was dominated by eyes that held the haunted, distant look of one who had witnessed too much, or perhaps too little of life's gentle graces. Elias felt a familiar wave of disappointment, bitter and heavy, wash over him. She was a broken thing, he surmised, a sickly reflection of the very world he had abandoned. He knew, with the cold certainty of a hunter assessing his prey, that this one would not even last 3 days. The mountain would consume her spirit before her fragile body could even begin to falter. He saw only a burden, another fleeting ghost destined to vanish with the dawn, confirming his own isolated fate. He could not yet perceive the silent, unyielding fire that burned beneath her transparency. He saw her as merely frail, missing the profound stillness of someone whose very existence was an act of defiance, whose fragility veiled a will forged in a crucible far colder than any mountain winter. The biting wind whipped around her, a cruel welcome to a land where softness had no place. She shivered, but something in her eyes, though shadowed by despair, refused to break. She had arrived not seeking comfort, but a sanctuary from a torment that promised no less a demise than the harshness of the peaks. Elias, observing her through the gray veil of his expectations, remained unconvinced. He simply believed she was yet another in a long line of failures. Her future here, he was certain, would be as brief and forgotten as the last snowfall. But as she took her first hesitant step towards the path that wound upwards, a silent, unspoken resolve settled upon her, a quiet acceptance of the perilous unknown that, to him, remained an enigma. The first days in Elias's formidable domain were a stark, brutal education. For a woman accustomed to the meager comforts of the plains, the mountain offered none. The air, thin and sharp, bit at her lungs with every shallow breath. Each morning brought the ache of muscles unused to such rigorous existence, to fetching water from a frozen stream, to hauling logs, however small, to the cabin's hungry maw. Elias watched her, a silent, unyielding presence. His gaze, like the winter wind, cold, appraising, expectant. He offered no comfort, no soft words, only the tacit understanding that this was his world, and she was an intruder, a temporary inconvenience. His distant manner, the deliberate precision of his movements, spoke of a life carved from stone, a life that had no room for weakness. She observed him too, this man of raw power and impenetrable silence, a man who seemed as much a part of the landscape as the ancient pines that guarded his solitude. The cabin itself was a testament to survival, not comfort. The rough-hewn walls retained the scent of pine and wood smoke, a scent that now seemed to cling to her very skin. Her nights were spent shivering beneath a rough bear hide, the only warmth coming from the crackling stone hearth, a beacon of defiant light against the encroaching darkness. Every sound was amplified in the oppressive silence. The howl of a distant wolf, the creak of the logs settling, the steady rhythm of Elias's breathing from his own corner of the room. Food was sparse, simple, and hard-won, a stark contrast to the small, meager meals she had once known. She felt her body protesting, a constant tremor in her hands, a hollow ache in her stomach, yet something deeper within her, a stubborn ember, refused to be extinguished. She knew the game Elias was playing, the silent countdown he kept in his heart. Every previous bride had fled, broken by the mountain's indifference, by his own impassive will. He was waiting for her to join their ranks. On the morning of the 7th day, a crisp, unforgiving dawn painted the peaks in hues of stark white and gray. As she stepped out onto the porch for water, her gaze fell upon a saddled horse, tethered near the chopping block. Beside it, a small canvas sack of provisions lay on the packed snow. The message was unmistakable, as clear as the frigid air that stung her cheeks. There were no words, no farewells offered or expected, only a silent, absolute command. Her time was up. The mountain had tested her, and in Elias's eyes, she had surely failed. A tremor ran through her, not just from the cold, but from the weight of his expectation, and the stark choice laid before her. Her mind, despite its exhaustion, raced back through the years, through the dusty, unforgiving streets of the town she had fled. She saw the judgmental eyes, heard the whispers, felt the crushing weight of a past she could not escape. Her skeletal frame was not merely a testament to hunger, but to a life that had worn her down, stripped her of dignity, leaving her an outcast, a pariah. The world below, with its false promises and crushing judgments, offered a death more certain than any frostbite. It was a slow, agonizing demise of the spirit, a surrender to despair that was far more terrifying than the immediate, physical dangers of the high country. To return was to admit defeat, not to Elias, but to herself, to the desperate spark of hope that had led her to this desolate refuge. The horse, standing patiently, seemed to mock her, a symbol of the escape route that led only back to the suffocating confines of her past. She closed her eyes, and in the deep canyons of her memory, she saw the faces of those who had cast her out, whose scorn had carved deeper wounds than any mountain beast could inflict. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in fiery oranges and deep purples, casting long, stark shadows across the snow. The air grew colder, and the faint, distant howls of the mountain's true inhabitants began to echo through the valleys. The horse remained untouched, the provisions undisturbed. She stood on the porch, a fragile silhouette, against the magnificent, brutal canvas of the mountain evening, trembling from the cold that seeped into her very bones. But in her eyes, though still haunted by the specters of her past, a different fire now burned. It was a stubborn, unyielding flame, a defiance that had survived every indignity, every abandonment. She would not leave. The world below had offered her only a slower, crueler death. Here, amidst the unforgiving peaks, she would at least choose her own struggle. With a silent, resolute gaze, she watched the last sliver of sunlight, vanish behind the highest peak, accepting her fate in the untamed wilderness. The sun had long since surrendered to the dominance of the night when the woman finally approached Elias's cabin. The last faint hues of twilight clung to the highest peaks, but down in the valley, a profound darkness had already settled, pierced only by the distant gleam of his hearth through a small, square window. Each step was a battle against the fatigue that threatened to buckle her knees, against the chill that had wormed its way into her very marrow. Her refusal to abandon the mountain had been an act of desperate will, but now the raw physicality of her situation bore down upon her. The path upward, treacherous and steep, seemed to lengthen with every labored breath, each crunch of snow beneath her worn boots echoing the harsh judgment of the wilderness. She was a trespasser in a world that allowed no softness, no unpreparedness. When she finally reached the small clearing, the cabin loomed, a dark, silent sentinel against the backdrop of the vast, indifferent mountainside. Smoke, thin and steady, curled from its stone chimney, a beacon of reluctant warmth in a sea of cold. Elias was a silhouette against the firelight as she approached, his massive frame filling the doorway. He did not speak, nor did he invite her in. His eyes, keen and shadowed, swept over her, taking in her trembling form, her wind-chapped face, the stubborn fire that still flickered in her gaze despite her obvious exhaustion. He had expected her to be gone. Her continued presence was an affront to his expectations, a challenge to the ordered solitude he had so carefully constructed. He was a man of the mountain, accustomed to its predictable rhythms, its clear-cut demands. Her refusal to leave was an anomaly, an unpredictable element in his carefully calibrated existence. He stood aside, his movements slow and deliberate, a silent, almost imperceptible gesture of grudging admittance. She entered, stepping from the biting cold into the cabin's embrace, an embrace that was less comfort and more a reprieve from certain demise. The air inside was thick with the scent of pine, burning wood, and something wild and elemental, a scent that spoke of hides and hard living. The stone fireplace, built with a craftsman's skill, cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls, revealing the Spartan nature of his sanctuary. A single, sturdy table occupied the center of the room, flanked by two rough stools. A bed of furs lay in one corner, his own, clearly, and a small, narrow cot in another, which he silently gestured towards. There was no welcome in his eyes, only a stark assessment. She was here, a fact he could not ignore, and thus a new reality to be managed. Her gaze, cautious and surveying, swept over the room. It was a place of utility, every object serving a purpose, every space carefully considered. On a rough-hewn shelf, amidst hunting tools and dried herbs, she noticed a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its feathers detailed with a delicate hand. The style, so distinct, so unlike the crude carvings she might expect from a mountain man, stirred a faint, distant memory. Her grandmother, long past, had often spoken of a distant, reclusive branch of their family, known for their unique, almost forgotten art of wood carving, a skill passed down through generations. They were said to have vanished into the northern ranges decades ago, seeking a purer, harder existence. It was a faint whisper from a forgotten past, a fleeting thought dismissed amidst the pressing reality of her present predicament. Yet the image of that bird, so exquisitely crafted, lingered. Elias, after a moment that stretched taut with unspoken questions, finally broke the silence, his voice a low rumble that seemed to rise from the very earth. He allowed her to keep her place within his walls, but his words carried the weight of a harsh truth, not a gesture of charity. The mountain, he conveyed, yielded nothing for free. Survival here was earned through toil, through respect for the wilderness, and through an unyielding contribution to the precarious balance of their existence. He spoke of the bitter cold that would soon descend, of the constant struggle for sustenance, of the unspoken rules that governed life in his solitary domain. He offered not comfort, but a sanctuary, a reprieve from the death that awaited her below, but it came with a price. She could stay, he made clear, but only if she understood that his mountain home was not a refuge for the weak, but a crucible for those willing to bend their will to its unforgiving demands. The agreement, stark and unspoken, settled between them like the deepening snows. Her presence was tolerated, not welcomed, and her every action was a test, a silent audition for her right to exist within his carefully guarded world. Elias, true to his nature, offered no explicit instructions, only the implicit expectation that she would observe, adapt, and contribute. He assigned her tasks without a word, a nod towards the water bucket, a gesture to the pile of unchopped firewood. She, in turn, accepted them with a silent resolve, each chore a small victory against the gnawing chill and the lingering ghosts of her past. Her hands, once delicate and unused to such labor, slowly began to harden. She learned to draw water from the partially frozen stream, the heavy pail, a constant reminder of her newfound strength. She learned to gather kindling, her eyes growing sharper, spotting the dry, brittle branches that would catch the easiest flame. The rhythmic sound of Elias's axe, splitting logs with practiced ease, became the backdrop to her days, a powerful, steady rhythm of survival. He watched her, his expression unreadable, as she struggled with the tasks that were second nature to him. He expected her to falter, to complain, to demand the comforts she had surely known in her old life, but she did not. Instead, she pushed through the aches and the shivers, finding a strange, quiet dignity in the simple act of enduring. One frigid afternoon, a howling wind threatened to rip the already meager insulation from the cabin walls. Elias was out, tending to his traps, and the woman found herself alone, listening to the incessant moan of the wind, feeling the cold seep through every crevice. Her gaze fell upon a stack of worn hides in a corner, remnants of past hunts, long neglected. Remembering the stories of her grandmother, who had taught her rudimentary skills of needle and thread, she began to work. With painstaking effort, she cut strips from the sturdier hides, patching the small gaps in the cabin walls, weaving tougher fibers into the tattered fur covering the doorway. It was a small act, born of desperation and an unexpected resourcefulness, but it made a difference. The cabin, imperceptibly, grew warmer, more resistant to the relentless assault of the mountain air. When Elias returned, his face a mask of frost and fatigue, he noticed the subtle change. The familiar draft that usually greeted him was lessened. His keen eyes, accustomed to every detail of his domain, swept over the newly patched walls, over the tightened fur entrance. He said nothing, his silence a profound statement in itself. Later, as she prepared the evening meal, a simple stew of dried venison and root vegetables, she observed him. He sat by the fire, sharpening his knife. His posture relaxed in a way she had not seen before. He looked at her, then a fleeting glance, devoid of the usual suspicion. It was a flicker of something new, something akin to grudging respect, or perhaps a dawning curiosity. Her quiet diligence, her unexpected ability to not just survive but to improve their shared existence, had begun to chip away at the formidable wall of his solitude. The woman, once a symbol of fragility, was slowly proving herself to be a force of quiet strength, subtly transforming his fortress of survival into something closer to a home. But the mountain had an abundance of challenges, and not all of them were found in the biting wind or the scarcity of food. One evening, as the first heavy snows began to fall, blanketing the peaks in a thick, silent shroud, a loud, guttural growl echoed through the valley, closer than any they had heard before. Elias, alerted by the sound, instinctively grabbed his rifle. His face, usually a study in stoic calm, tightened with a grim apprehension. He looked at the woman, a silent warning in his eyes, as if the mountain itself was challenging her newfound purpose. The growl came again, closer still, a territorial roar that promised a confrontation. The sound, raw and primal, cut through the quiet hum of their newly established peace. A stark reminder that even a transformed sanctuary remained ever vulnerable to the untamed wild. The growl, deep and resonant, was not merely a sound, it was a physical presence, vibrating through the very timbers of the cabin. Elias, rifle in hand, moved with the swift, silent grace of a predator, his gaze fixed on the heavy wooden door. The woman, her breath caught in her throat, felt a cold dread seize her. This was the raw, untamed heart of the mountain, a danger far more immediate than the insidious chill or the slow pangs of hunger. The cabin, their fragile haven, now felt terrifyingly exposed. Another growl, closer still, was followed by the unmistakable scratching of claws against the logs outside. A large, dark shadow loomed against the single window, its form massive and threatening. Elias knew the beast, an old, scarred grizzly, whose territory had been encroached upon by the unusually harsh winter, driven by hunger to bolder, more desperate acts. He understood its ferocity, its primal need. To confront it head-on, inside the cramped cabin, would be folly, a near certain death for them both. He motioned for the woman to stay low, his voice a guttural whisper that carried the weight of grave danger. His plan was simple: draw it out, lure it away from the cabin, and face it in the open. But as he began to unbar the heavy door, her hand, surprisingly firm, grasped his arm. Her eyes, wide with fear, held a sudden, desperate flicker of insight. She pointed to the stone hearth, where a small iron pot, filled with bubbling, aromatic pine tar, simmered for their waterproofing efforts. Then, with a frantic urgency, she gestured to the small, narrow opening in the cabin's loft, a high vent usually used for smoke. Elias paused, his hunter's instinct warring with her unexpected, almost nonsensical suggestion. The grizzly roared again, a frustrated bellow that shook the very foundations of their refuge. There was no time for hesitation. Trusting, for the first time, in something beyond his own hardened judgment, he followed her frantic directions. With a strength born of pure adrenaline, he hoisted the heavy pot of scalding pine tar towards the loft opening. The woman, scrambling onto a stool, guided his aim, her hands steady despite their tremor. As the grizzly slammed its immense weight against the door, threatening to splinter it from its hinges, Elias, with a mighty surge, tipped the pot. The thick, steaming tar cascaded downwards, not onto the beast, but through the high vent, landing with a sickening splat just beyond the cabin wall. The grizzly, caught off guard by the unexpected shower of steaming, pungent liquid, let out a pained, surprised roar, backing away from the cabin. It was not a mortal blow, but a shock, a sudden, burning deterrent that sent the enraged animal lumbering away into the darkness, its roars fading into the distant forest. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by their ragged breathing. The cabin, no longer under siege, seemed to settle back into its familiar quiet, but something fundamental had shifted between them. Elias lowered his rifle, his gaze fixed on the woman. Her face, pale and streaked with soot, was illuminated by the flickering firelight, her chest heaving. It was then, in the aftermath of their narrow escape, that the walls he had built around his heart began to crumble, just as the cabin walls had almost given way. He saw not a frail burden, but a fiercely intelligent partner, a resilient spirit who had, with a flash of insight, saved their lives. He spoke then, his voice rougher than usual, the words unaccustomed on his tongue. He spoke of the solitude that had become his prison, of the silent grief for a family lost to a senseless fever years ago, a loss that had driven him to the mountain's harsh embrace. He confessed the fear that had kept him isolated, the belief that any connection would only lead to more pain, more abandonment. She listened, her eyes mirroring his raw vulnerability, and then, slowly, haltingly, she began to speak of her own past. She recounted the endless years of struggle in a drought-stricken land, of losing her own family to famine and disease, of the crushing judgment from a community that saw her thinness not as a sign of hardship, but as a mark of ill fortune, casting her out as an omen of bad times. She spoke of the shame, the fear of starvation, the desperate, solitary journey that had led her to his remote refuge. They were two outcasts, stripped bare by loss and abandonment, finding in the shared telling of their wounds a profound, unexpected connection. The truth was not a revelation from the outside world, but the baring of their souls to each other, a silent pact forged in the crucible of shared survival. The crisis had passed, leaving behind a fragile, trembling peace. But as the last echoes of the grizzly's retreat faded, a new sound began to filter through the night, the distinct, metallic clatter of a pickaxe striking rock, faint but insistent, coming from somewhere higher up the mountain, a place where no one else was meant to be. The sound was alien, an unwelcome disruption to the profound intimacy that had just been forged between them, hinting at a new, unseen threat that had quietly settled onto the mountain while their attention had been fixed on the beast at their door. In the quiet aftermath of the grizzly's retreat and the profound sharing of their deepest sorrows, a new rhythm settled into the cabin. The raw, desperate edge of survival had softened, replaced by a nascent understanding, a shared purpose that went beyond mere endurance. Elias, no longer merely tolerating her presence, now sought her quiet company. His movements around the cabin became less brusque. His rare smiles, though fleeting, were genuine, touching his eyes with a warmth she had not thought possible. The woman, for her part, found her voice not in idle chatter, but in observations about the wilderness, about the subtle changes in the weather, about the best methods for preserving game. They worked together, their tasks now intertwined. He taught her to track, to read the ancient signs left by deer and rabbit in the snow, her small, nimble hands surprisingly adept at setting snares. She, in turn, showed him how to mend torn garments with careful stitches, transforming worn furs into surprisingly warm and functional blankets. In the evenings, by the crackling fire, the heavy silence of the past began to lift. He would carve, his hands, so powerful with an axe, crafting delicate figures from small blocks of pine, his lost family evident in the tiny, perfectly formed details. She would watch, her gaze lingering on his strong, calloused hands, and sometimes he would tell her stories of the mountain, of its hidden caves and ancient spirits, tales passed down through his own reclusive family, the same family, she now realized, whose unique carving style she had recognized. The discovery of their shared ancestral connection to this land through the forgotten art of carving deepened their bond, giving their unlikely meeting a sense of destiny. The spring thaw arrived, bringing with it a vibrant flush of life to the valleys, and with it, a fragile bloom of peace within the cabin. Their meals, once sparse and utilitarian, became shared rituals, accompanied by quiet conversation and the occasional, comfortable laughter. The woman, no longer skeletal, had gained a healthy, vital glow. Her cheeks, once hollow, now held a soft color, and her eyes, though still holding the wisdom of past pain, shone with a newfound light. Elias, too, had shed some of his formidable armor. The hard lines of his face had softened, and the deep-set loneliness in his eyes had begun to recede, replaced by an attentive warmth whenever he looked at her. The cabin, once a fortress against the world, had slowly, irrevocably become a home, a sanctuary built not just of logs and stone, but of shared trust and mutual healing. One crisp afternoon, as they sat on the porch, mending fishing nets, the quiet hum of their peaceful existence was shattered by a sudden, distant cry. It was a human sound, sharp and desperate, carried on the wind from the lower slopes of the mountain. Elias's head snapped up, his senses instantly alert, the easy contentment in his posture vanishing, replaced by the coiled tension of a hunter on alert. The sound came again, closer this time, clearer. It was a woman's voice, pleading, urgent, filled with a raw terror that made the hairs on the back of Elias's neck stand on end. He knew that sound. It spoke of profound danger, of a world encroaching upon their isolated haven. He gripped her hand, his eyes scanning the horizon, a grim determination setting on his face. The peace, so hard won, was about to be tested. The mountain, it seemed, was not yet finished with its trials. The desperate cries, echoing through the mountain air, sliced through the fragile peace they had cultivated, a stark reminder that their sanctuary was not impregnable. Elias, his grip on her hand tightening instinctively, knew that sound. It was the frantic plea of someone truly lost, truly afraid, and it pulled at a deep, protective instinct within him, a stark contrast to the hardened isolation he had embraced for so long. He understood the dangers of responding to such a call. The wilderness was full of snares, both natural and human. But the woman, her own past etched with the fear of abandonment, looked at him with an unspoken plea in her eyes. How could they, who had found refuge from their own torments, ignore the cry of another? He moved with swift purpose, grabbing his rifle and a satchel of basic supplies. The woman, without a word, began to pack a small bag of medicinal herbs she had carefully gathered and dried, her hands moving with a newfound confidence. They descended the steep, winding path, their steps sure and practiced, guided by the increasingly desperate cries. As they neared the lower slopes, a disturbing sight greeted them. A young woman, barely more than a girl, lay huddled beneath a fallen log, her clothes torn, her face streaked with dirt and tears. But it was not just her distress that caught Elias's attention. Standing over her, their faces grim and unyielding, were two men, rough-hewn and menacing, clearly not mountain folk. One held a wicked-looking hunting knife, the other a coil of rope. They were bounty hunters, it seemed, their eyes holding the cold, calculating glint of those who saw human beings as mere property. The girl, upon seeing Elias and the woman, let out a fresh sob of terror, pointing a trembling finger at the mountain man. She cried out that he was the notorious recluse, the one whispered about in the lower valleys, a man rumored to shelter outlaws and runaways. The bounty hunters, their expressions hardening, immediately shifted their focus. They had come for the girl, a runaway ward of the county, but the presence of the legendary mountain man and his unexpected female companion presented an even more lucrative prize. The elder of the two, a man with a scarred face and a cruel smile, stepped forward, his eyes lingering on the woman, then on Elias. He declared that Elias was known to protect the lost, and that they, the law's long arm, had come to reclaim what was due. He stated with a chilling certainty that they would take not just the girl, but Elias and the woman as well, for obstructing justice, and for the valuable bounty on his head for some forgotten frontier crime. The situation was far more perilous than they had anticipated. This was not a random encounter, but a calculated invasion of their sanctuary. The men had clearly tracked the girl, but they had also known where to find Elias, hinting at a network of information that stretched far beyond the isolated peaks. As the bounty hunters began to encircle them, their movements slow and deliberate, designed to intimidate, Elias pushed the woman gently behind him, his rifle held steady, a silent barrier against the encroaching threat. But the odds were against them, 2 against 3, and the girl was a liability, her terror making her clumsy and loud. The man with the scarred face smirked, his gaze fixed on Elias. He spoke of the harshness of the mountain, of how it stripped away all pretenses. He boasted that they knew of the mountain man's history, of his reclusive nature, of his previous failures to keep women in his isolated home. He claimed that the woman, frail and sickly when she arrived, was merely another captive, another lost soul Elias had ensnared. He then offered Elias a stark choice: surrender the girl and the woman, and he might yet escape with his life, or face the consequences. He promised that the mountain would not protect him from the relentless reach of the law. As the bounty hunters tightened their circle, their faces grim, the woman stepped out from behind Elias, her own gaze steady, meeting the cruel eyes of the lead bounty hunter. In that moment of overwhelming peril, she made a choice that stunned even Elias. She stepped forward towards the men, her voice clear despite her trembling, stating that she would go with them if only they would leave Elias and the girl unharmed. She would sacrifice herself to protect the home she had found, and the man who had, against all odds, become her protector. The woman's selfless offer hung in the frigid mountain air, a defiant challenge to the brutal calculations of the bounty hunters. Elias, momentarily stunned, felt a surge of raw fury. Her sacrifice, born of a profound love and loyalty, was a burden he could not bear. He stepped forward, his rifle now aimed directly at the lead bounty hunter, his voice a low growl that held the dangerous edge of a cornered beast. He would not allow it. This place, this home, was hers as much as it was his, and he would defend it, and her, with every fiber of his being. The scarred bounty hunter merely laughed, a harsh, grating sound that scraped against the quiet dignity of the mountainside. He saw Elias's protective rage not as strength, but as a weakness to be exploited. He made a signal to his men, and they moved in, two of them lunging for Elias, while the third, quicker than expected, grabbed the woman's arm, intending to drag her away. The girl, still cowering, let out a terrified scream. The battle, swift and brutal, erupted amidst the snow-dusted pines. Elias fought with the ferocity of a wild animal defending its young. His years of solitary survival had honed his movements, making him a formidable opponent. He used the terrain to his advantage, ducking behind ancient trees, using the uneven ground to trip his adversaries. The sharp crack of his rifle echoed through the valley, not as a shot fired at a man, but as a warning, a deliberate near miss that sent a clear message: he would protect his own. As one of the bounty hunters, emboldened by his partner's move to seize the woman, charged, Elias sidestepped with astonishing agility. With a swift, practiced movement, he disarmed the man, sending his rifle clattering uselessly into a snowdrift. He then used the man's own momentum against him, sending him tumbling headfirst into a thicket of thorny bushes. Meanwhile, the woman, surprisingly, was not helpless. The bounty hunter holding her arm had underestimated her. Her gaunt frame belied a surprising strength, forged in the crucible of her past and the harsh demands of the mountain. With a sudden, desperate twist, she broke free from his grasp. As he lunged again, she instinctively ducked, grabbing a sturdy branch from the ground. With a precise, swift movement, she swung it, not at his head, but at his knee, sending a sharp crack echoing through the air. The man cried out, clutching his leg, effectively taken out of the fight. She was no warrior, but she was a survivor, and her actions, born of necessity, demonstrated a deep understanding of self-preservation that few would expect from her. The scarred bounty hunter, seeing his men falter, snarled in frustration. He drew his knife, its blade glinting menacingly in the pale light. He lunged at Elias, aiming for a decisive blow. Elias, anticipating the attack, met him not with brute force, but with the wisdom of the wilderness. He shifted, not towards the man, but away, luring him closer to the treacherous edge of a steep incline they had just descended. As the bounty hunter overextended, poised to strike, Elias used his intimate knowledge of the unstable ground. With a powerful kick to a loose rock, he sent a small cascade of snow and stones tumbling down the slope, directly at the man's feet. The bounty hunter lost his footing, tumbling helplessly down the incline, his curses fading as he slid into a deep snowdrift, effectively neutralized, but not gravely injured. He was trapped, but not broken, a grim reminder of the mountain's indifference. The battle was over. The two remaining bounty hunters, one clutching his leg, the other struggling to free himself from the snowdrift, were defeated not by death, but by the mountain's cunning and the unexpected resilience of its inhabitants. Elias stood over them, his rifle still held firm, his eyes now blazing with a quiet, triumphant resolve. He gave them a simple, chilling command: leave the mountain and never return, or face a fate far worse than any bounty hunter's prison. He took their weapons, leaving them only their pride and their injuries. The girl, now released from her fear, scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning awe. She looked at Elias, the legendary recluse, and then at the woman whose fragile appearance concealed such a fierce spirit. The mountain had not just protected them, it had proven that its true strength lay not in isolation, but in the fierce, unyielding bond forged between those who dared to call it home. The men, defeated and humiliated, were left to find their own way off the mountain, a long, painful journey that would forever echo with the lesson of their hubris. A year had passed since the snows had carried away the echoes of the confrontation, since the bounty hunters, humbled and bruised, had vanished from the mountain slopes. The fierce trials of the wilderness, which had once seemed an endless test, now felt like a distant memory, replaced by a profound and steady peace. The cabin, once a solitary fortress, had been utterly transformed. Its walls, once a barrier against the world, now cradled a vibrant, blossoming life. Elias, the man of granite and silence, was no longer a solitary figure. His days, once marked by the stark rhythm of survival, now unfolded with the gentle hum of shared existence. He still rose with the sun, still tended his traps and chopped wood, but now his movements carried a new purpose, a soft joy that had replaced the gnawing emptiness of his past. The rough bare hides, once merely for warmth, now adorned a crib, small and sturdy, nestled beside their bed. The air in the cabin, once thick with the scent of pine and wood smoke, now often carried the sweet, earthy aroma of freshly baked bread, or the delicate scent of dried herbs brewing for a soothing tea. The woman, once a skeletal figure haunting the edge of survival, was now radiant, her cheeks rosy with health and happiness. Her hands, no longer merely calloused, moved with the confident grace of a woman who had found her purpose, her home. Her laughter, once a rare and fragile sound, now mingled freely with the soft cooing of their child. Yes, a child. A small, vibrant life, born amidst the untamed peaks, a testament to their enduring love and the miraculous power of redemption. The little one, a girl with Elias's strong jaw and the woman's intelligent, curious eyes, was a living bridge between their fractured pasts and their hopeful future. She was a symbol of the profound healing that had blossomed in the most unlikely of places, proof that even in the harshest wilderness, life finds a way to flourish, strong and beautiful. The presence of their daughter brought a final, poignant revelation. The intricately carved wooden bird, which had once stirred a faint memory in the woman, now sat on the mantelpiece, a treasured family heirloom. Elias, in his quiet moments, would often carve similar, smaller birds, teaching his daughter the ancient craft passed down through his own lineage. As she watched him, she suddenly recalled a story from her own grandmother, a forgotten tale of a legendary mountain clan known for their unique wood carvings, a clan that had welcomed and sheltered outcasts, drawing strength from those cast aside by society. It was then, observing her husband and child, that the full weight of the past settled upon her. Her ancestors, long ago, had sought refuge in these very mountains, welcomed by Elias's forebears. Their meeting, their survival, their love, was not mere chance, but the fated intertwining of two ancient lines, destined to meet and forge a new legacy on this very peak. And so, the mountain man and the woman, once pariahs, once lost, had found more than just survival. They had found each other. They had built a home not just of wood and stone, but of resilient spirits, intertwined destinies, and an unyielding love. Their story echoed through the valleys, a quiet legend of true strength found not in solitude, but in companionship, of family forged not by blood, but by choice, by sacrifice, by the sheer courage to stay. For home, they had learned, was never truly a place, but a feeling of fierce belonging, a sacred space carved out of the wilderness by two souls who refused to be broken. Their love, like the mountains themselves, was enduring, a beacon of hope against the endless, vast horizon. Did you enjoy this journey? Tell us from what corner of the world you're watching this story from. Leave your comment, and to make sure you don't miss the next adventure, subscribe to the channel.